He first saw her on a television screen, her voice soaring through the symphony hall like something otherworldly. In that instant, Robert Redford knew, she was the one. But what happens when the love of your life is also the one that slips away? Now at 88, after decades of glory, fame, and unforgettable films, Redford is finally opening up about the woman who left an indelible mark on his soul. Behind the Hollywood legend lies a hidden love story, one filled with passion, heartbreak, and a truth he can no longer keep silent. It was a love that lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling, a love that shaped Robert Redford in ways the world never knew. Why did he guard this secret for so many years? What tore them apart, and does he still regret the choices that kept them separated? For decades, Redford stood as one of Hollywood's most celebrated icons, his golden hair, piercing blue eyes, and quiet sophistication defining an era of cinema. To the world, he was the perfect leading man, a symbol of charm and grace. But behind the fame, behind the carefully crafted image, lived a story he never wanted to share. A love so powerful it haunted him, a heartbreak so profound it remained buried in silence, until now. At 88, after a lifetime filled with soaring triumphs and heartbreaking losses, Robert Redford finally revealed what so many had long suspected. The love of his life was not a fleeting Hollywood affair, nor a glamorous romance from his golden years, it was something far deeper, something he carried in silence for decades. The question that lingers is, why did he wait so long to confess the truth? Long before the red carpets, before his name was spoken in the same breath as legends like Paul Newman and Barbra Streisand, Robert Redford was simply a boy from Santa Monica, California. Born on August 29, 1936, he grew up in a modest working-class home. His father, a strict accountant, believed in order and discipline, while his mother was the warmth and soul of the household. Yet young Robert was never one to follow convention. Restless, curious, and endlessly drawn to art and adventure, he was destined to carve a path far beyond the boundaries of ordinary life. Robert Redford was never the kind of boy who could sit still. In the classrooms of Van Nuys, while teachers drilled equations and lessons into restless minds, his thoughts were already far beyond the chalkboards and textbooks. He sketched, he painted, he dreamed, his imagination always reaching for a world larger than the one around him. Sports became his refuge, and with a tennis racket in hand, he was quick, agile, and fiercely competitive. But even then, victory on the court couldn't quiet the restlessness inside him. Something was missing, a deeper purpose, a calling he had yet to discover. By his teenage years, that hunger for more turned into rebellion. He began testing limits, breaking rules, and pushing against the life his parents hoped he would follow. Redford wasn't made for quiet conformity, even then, he was chasing something greater, though he didn't yet know what it was. His rebellious nature intensified, and before long, he found himself immersed in a reckless lifestyle. It was this very rebellious spirit that brought him to the University of Colorado. For a time, it appeared he had discovered stability, but it was short-lived. Freedom was intoxicating for Robert. He became involved with the wrong crowd, indulging in heavy drinking and partying late into the night. It didn't take long for his grades to plummet beyond recovery. The school had no option but to intervene. Before he realized it, he had lost his scholarship. Expelled, aimless, and filled with shame, he returned home. Yet, deep down, he understood he couldn't remain there. His future wasn't going to be found within the confines of a classroom. It awaited him elsewhere, ready for him to take a leap of faith. Thus, with hardly any money and no solid plan, he packed his belongings and set off for Europe. It was the 1950s, and the continent was still healing from the wounds of war. But for Robert, it represented a realm of discovery. He roamed through France, Spain, and Italy, surviving on little more than inspiration. His days were spent sketching in cafes, observing people, and soaking in the beauty surrounding him. He discovered comfort in art, in the notion that stories could be conveyed through images, expressions, and movement. During this period, something transformed within him. The carefree artist, once unanchored and uncertain, began to perceive a new path emerging. Acting was never something he had genuinely contemplated, but the thought of stepping into various lives, embodying emotions, and narrating stories started to captivate him. Consequently, he made a choice that would alter the trajectory of his life. He would return to America, but not to the life he had left behind. New York City became his first destination. He enrolled at the esteemed Pratt Institute to study painting. However, once again, the allure of something greater drew him in another direction. The American Academy of Dramatic Arts was a far cry from the casual sketchbooks he had carried throughout Europe. It was a fierce and competitive environment, filled with individuals who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of stardom. In contrast, Robert was simply curious about where this journey would lead him. The initial years were challenging. There were no significant roles or unexpected breakthroughs that thrust him into the limelight. He took on minor roles, appearing in TV shows, stage performances, and anything that would help him get by. Yet, amidst the hardships, something within him had ignited. For the first time, he felt he was precisely where he belonged. It was during this phase of his life that he encountered a woman who would transform everything. Her name was Lola Vanvegen. She was unlike the Hollywood dreamers who populated the studios of New York. Lola was composed, intelligent, and deeply anchored in her beliefs. Hailing from Provo, Utah, she was raised in the traditions of Mormonism, a world that felt worlds apart from Robert's free-spirited adventures across Europe. Nevertheless, from their very first meeting, there was an undeniable connection between them. At a time when Robert was still on his journey of self-discovery, Lola embodied the stability he craved. She recognized something in him that others overlooked. A profound depth that went beyond his golden-haired allure and restless nature. In return, he was captivated by her steadfast confidence and the quiet strength that centered her. Their love story was not marked by grand gestures or tumultuous romance. It was straightforward, authentic, and remarkably resilient. By 1958, just as Robert began to gain some traction in his acting career, they made a choice that took everyone by surprise. They eloped. It was not a lavish Hollywood affair. No flashing lights or designer dresses. It was merely the two of them escaping together because they couldn't stand to be apart. They were hardly more than children. Yet, in that moment, they felt they had everything they needed. They resided in small apartments, getting by on whatever acting gigs Robert could secure. The future was unclear and money was scarce, but it didn't matter. For them, the fact that they were loved was sufficient. Their narrative seemed to be developing like the ideal romance for a while. Even the happiest people in life can have unexpected events happen to them. A terrible catastrophe befell their young family as Robert followed his aspirations. When Scott, their first child, was born, they experienced a joy they had never experienced before. However, that happiness quickly gave way to heartache a few months later. Their infant child suddenly stopped breathing one night. Sudden infant death syndrome was the cause. Quiet, unfathomable, and merciless. Just loss, no red flags, no second chances. Robert had always been resilient and the kind to keep going in the face of difficulty. But he never talked about how this broke him. Lola became his anchor in spite of her own sorrow. She resisted giving in to the catastrophe. They managed to bear the burden of their loss without allowing it to break them, somehow. In the most agonizing way possible, their love had been put to the test. They were still standing, though, for the moment. Their relationship experienced additional difficulties as Robert's career took off, but they would eventually become too significant to overlook. Robert Redford was starting to get international attention. His career was no longer limited to vying for little television parts. He was about to experience something considerably more significant. His talent was becoming indisputable by the early 1960s, and Hollywood was beginning to take notice. He appeared opposite Elizabeth Ashley in the lead role of the light-hearted romantic comedy Barefoot in the Park, which marked his Broadway debut. He was attractive, vivacious, and had the ideal amount of childish mischief for the part. Hollywood moved quickly to capitalize on the play's enormous success. Redford soon found himself moving from the stage to the movie theater. What began as cameos in TV series and minor roles in movies swiftly grew into something far bigger. He was cast in the pivotal role of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid during the late 1960s. His chemistry with Paul Newman was explosive, and the movie became an immediate classic. They became one of the most adored on-screen pairs ever because of their relaxed, organic banter. Robert Redford, the quintessential Hollywood leading actor, rose to fame almost immediately. The business could not get enough of his easy fusion of quiet brilliance and rugged masculinity. Women loved him, and men admired him. However, as his reputation in Hollywood grew, his personal life was under increasing strain. He had changed from a struggling performer living in cramped lodgings. He was now filming in far-flung places, traveling for months at a time, and being pushed in a dozen different directions all the time. This new reality should have been exciting for a man who had always been passionately autonomous. However, it was an impossible balancing act for a father and husband. Lola had always encouraged him to pursue his goals. She had been there with him during the lean years, when success was only a dream. However, his profession required him to be away from home more and more. And when he was at home, he was frequently worn out and distracted, his thoughts still stuck in the realm of directors, scripts, and never-ending movie sets. Although their love had already endured catastrophe, it was now dealing with a much more sinister, gradual disintegration. They never really recovered from the stress of his protracted absences or the sadness of losing Scott. Redford loved their additional children, Shauna, David, and Amy. But in the back of his mind, he felt guilty about not being there enough. He found it more difficult to cling to the things that had earlier kept him rooted as his success increased. He never lost his love for Lola or his admiration for the family they had created. However, something had changed. And despite his efforts to combat it, the gap between them kept widening. Redford solidified his position as one of the world's biggest stars during the 1970s. He didn't only pursue box office success, instead, he picked jobs that were meaningful to him. Being another Hollywood hottie wasn't what he wanted. With Barbra Streisand, he was able to demonstrate his dramatic depth and get the substance he desired. And every one of the president's men shone that he could handle highly sensitive political positions. However, his personal life became increasingly difficult as his career took off. They could no longer ignore the time they were spending apart from Lola. The emotional gap had become too great. And they were both aware of what was coming by the early 1980s. After over 28 years of marriage, Robert and Lola decided to end their union in 1985. There were only two people who had created a life together but were unable to reconnect. There was no dramatic scandal or violent altercations. Even though they continued to get along well and prioritize their kids, there was no doubt that something had been lost. Redford was alone for the first time in decades. He put all of his energy into his work in the years that followed, maybe to avoid the loneliness that came with closing such a lengthy chapter. In addition to acting, he started directing, taking charge of the narratives he wished to convey. He was more than an actor now. He was a filmmaker, a visionary storyteller. He was pushing himself to new creative limits, yet something was lacking. Once he had loved dearly. And that love had never really left him, even though it had slipped through his fingers. He was involved in partnerships that initially appeared promising throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. His own fierce spirit was matched by that of the Brazilian actress Sônia Braga. Although their romance was intense and thrilling, it was not meant to endure. Then he met the beautiful Swedish actress Lena Olin while working on Havana. For a while, it appeared as though he had discovered something genuine once more as their on-screen connection carried over into real life. However, as was frequently the case with romances in Hollywood, the heat was intense for a short time before waning. They weren't the issue. He was the one. Redford had never really learned how to stand still since he had spent so much of his life chasing achievement and stories. And he found himself reflecting on the past and the love he had lost during the quiet times, when no cameras were rolling. He had created something genuinely amazing by the middle of the 1990s. An oasis for independent filmmakers is the Sundance Film Festival. It reflected all that he believed in. Genuineness, originality, and a reluctance to fit in with Hollywood's preconceptions. People who might not have otherwise had the opportunity to share their story were given a voice. Nevertheless, he remained restless in spite of his success, fame, and admiration. He had established a career that most actors could only imagine having. He had helmed important motion pictures. He had left behind more than just his acting career. Nevertheless, none of it occupied the empty area. Then, in the most surprising way, he met the person who would make all the difference. It wasn't at a Hollywood event, in a movie studio, or through contacts in the business. It took place at his cherished Sundance Mountain Resort, a location that seemed far different from the turmoil of his life. He initially got to know Sybil Saugers there. Sybil was not a member of the film industry, unlike the ladies he had previously dated. She was neither a celebrity nor a Hollywood star. She was an artist who, instead of using cameras and scripts, observed the world via color and movement. And maybe the most unexpected aspect. She didn't know his true identity. She was aware of Robert Redford's name, of course, but she hadn't kept up with his career, seen all of his movies, or fallen in love with the Hollywood-created image of him. She wasn't speaking to Hollywood icon Robert Redford when they first met. She was conversing with Redford. He felt for the first time in years that he could simply be himself. Just two people brought together, not by celebrity or wealth, but by something more subdued and genuine, with no parts to play or cameras to face. His true love had never been a fleeting affair or a Hollywood romance. It had always been the person he lost, the person who existed before his notoriety and before everyone knew who he was. Lola had always been his true love. Robert felt calmer than he had in years because of something about Sable. She was unique. Expectations, pretense, and reminders of the Hollywood system that had taken over so much of his life were all gone. Quiet understanding, lengthy discussions about art and the environment, and a shared appreciation of nature formed the foundation of their partnership. The fast-paced, high-profile romances he had previously been involved in were a far cry from this. Perhaps that's why it was successful. Redford had begun to distance himself from the unrelenting rigors of the film industry by the early 2000s. He had nothing further to demonstrate. His reputation as a filmmaker, actor, and supporter of indie filmmaking was assured. With the Sundance Film Festival, he had created something enduring, providing a forum for perspectives that Hollywood frequently disregarded. He had helmed meaningful movies with stories that reverberate off-screen. He now gave himself permission to concentrate on anything else, on a life away from celebrity, for the first time in decades. Robert and Sable were married in Hamburg, Germany, in a private ceremony in 2009. There were no lavish Hollywood parties or exclusive magazine deals, far from the flashing cameras and sensational headlines. It was intimate and straightforward, just the way they wanted it. He had been known for years as a man who passionately protected his private life. Someone who would not allow the public to see past the meticulously constructed facade. He didn't have to hide, though, with Sybil. He no longer wanted to live up to his fame, and she had no interest in it either. Even though he was content with his peaceful life, a part of him was still stuck in the past. No matter how much time passes, certain loves never really go away. He had been carrying it about for decades. He had never really acknowledged it. Not to anyone, not to himself. The kind of love that transcends time and situation. The kind that hovers, waiting for the appropriate opportunity to be recognized. When questioned about his personal life in interviews, he would frequently smile and provide calm, courteous responses that gave away nothing. However, his hesitation when the subject of Lola was brought up was evident to those who knew him best. There was a sense of melancholy, a silent need that persisted. The identical question had been posed to him for years. Who was his life's greatest love? He always brushed it off with a joke or a cryptic comment rather than giving a direct answer. Perhaps because it would seem too true to utter out. Perhaps because acknowledging it would require facing the reality that some things are irreversible. But after a lifetime of keeping quiet, he finally announced it at the age of 88. He loved Sybil very much, but it wasn't her. It wasn't any of the short-lived love affairs that had passed. It was the woman who had supported him before he became famous and before everyone knew who he was. The lady who had supported him through pain, uncertainty, and everything that could have broken them, and who had been his pillar of support when he was just a struggling artist. Lola was always there. The confession was made in a private time of introspection rather than at a dramatic interview or well-written biography. He acknowledged that she had remained the love of his life in spite of everything, their divorce, the years they had spent apart, and the distinct lives they had created. There was no regret. Not precisely. He didn't hope for something different, didn't wish for an alternative world in which they had remained together. They had made the decisions that felt appropriate at the time and lived the lives that were intended for them. However, that didn't alter the reality. There are loves that never go away. They remain in the voids between memories, define you, and mold you. Rewriting history or undermining the love he had discovered later in life were not the goals of his confession. It was merely a recognition of something that had been there all along, just waiting to be expressed. After their divorce, Lola got married again and started a new life away from the baggage of their previous relationship. Like him, she had discovered her own bliss. They had kept in touch, always linked by their common history and their children. However, they had never discussed what they had lost or gone back in time beyond the necessities of co-parenting. Maybe they didn't have to. It's possible that certain things are comprehended without being expressed. Nevertheless, there was a feeling of finality as he at last acknowledged the breadth of their common experience. Not in the sense that things had to be fixed, but rather in the sense that accepting reality lightens the burden and makes it seem less like a secret and more like something that just exists. He had devoted a significant portion of his life to seeking purpose, meaning, and a logical explanation. Ultimately, he came to the realization that the object he had been looking for had always been there. For many years, Robert had been a man who thrived on activity, the next big tale to tell, the next initiative, or the next challenge. However, in the solitude of his latter years, he found himself thinking back on the events that had molded him and the decisions that had brought him to this point. He had received everything from Hollywood. It had taken things away from him, but it had also given him fame, fortune, and the capacity to write and tell stories that were important. Moments in time that would never be relived. Even though he was sitting there with the weight of his own admission, that Lola had been his true love, he wasn't depressed. If anything, speaking it at last brought a sense of relief. The past did not need to be altered. Life had happened as it was supposed to. And despite their separation, there was no denying the truth of what they had in common. Even so, there were little, insignificant moments when he pondered what might have happened if he had put love before ambition. Had he prioritized his family over his profession, stayed at home more, or realized sooner what was really important? However, had he not chosen the route he did? Would he have developed into the man he is now? There was no real answer to the query. When he was still a child, his mother had died. He didn't completely comprehend the manner in which this loss influenced him until he became a dad. The wound from losing his first child, Scott, had never fully healed. Then there was James. In addition to being his son, Redford had a great deal of respect for James. He had followed in his father's footsteps as a storyteller who used cinema to highlight significant environmental and social issues, rather than as an actor. They had collaborated, developed projects together, and were passionate about raising their voices to change the world. Following years of dealing with health issues, James passed away in 2020. The loss was of a different sort. Redford had been a young guy when Scott died, still learning how to deal with loss and still attempting to keep himself together for Lola. It was different with James, though. He was old enough to realize that it was irrevocable. How painful it must be to have to bury a child twice in one lifetime. Something changed in him after losing James. It increased his awareness of how little time he had left and how valuable each moment was. He had been constantly pursuing something that was just out of his grasp throughout his life. However, he now understood that the things he had already experienced were the most significant. The love, the people, and the memories. He had avoided talking about his history and the things he didn't want to think about for a long time. However, he no longer saw the benefit of holding back as he approached his twilight years. He eventually responded when the topic of who was the greatest love of his life, the one he had been asked so many times before, came up. Despite their seeming simplicity, the words were loaded with decades of meaning. Lola was the one. Lola had been the one all along. He spoke with the knowledge that some loves are destined to last forever rather than with regret or longing. That despite the fact that their lives had taken different turns and that they had been apart for more years than together, she had made a lasting impression on his spirit. With Sybil, he had created a lovely existence that provided him serenity in ways he had never experienced before, and he treasured it. However, his relationship with Lola had been something completely different, and it had influenced the core of his identity. He reflected on their past as a young couple, two children who had fled together without a plan because they felt that love was sufficient. He conceived approximately the lifestyles that they had built, the family they had created, the tragedies that they had survived. He thought approximately the instant all of it slipped away, once they found out they could not preserve on any longer, even though a part of him had wanted to. And now, after all these years, he was in the end prepared to well known what he had constantly known. There was no sadness in it, no longing to rewrite records, simply in recognition of the reality. He had lived a complete existence, one packed with love, loss, triumph, and heartbreak. He were given possibilities the majority should handiest dream of. He had performed roles that have become a part of cinematic history. He had created a legacy that could outlive him. But on the heart of all of it, on the core of the entirety, there was love. And sometimes love doesn't need to be best to be unforgettable. As he sat with the load of his confession, Robert Redford failed to experience sadness, nor did he want to change the past. There was a quiet popularity in subsequently announcing out loud what he had continually regarded. Love, in its truest shape, never surely disappears. It lingers in reminiscences, in the spaces among moments, inside the manner someone shapes you long after they're long gone. He had spent an entire life telling stories on display screen, at the back of the digital camera, via the artists he had championed at Sundance. However, this tale, the only that had described him the maximum, had never been written or spoken approximately until now. Maybe he had been defensive of it, keeping it for himself. Or maybe for years he had been afraid to face it. However, now there was not anything left to run from. The arena knew him as a Hollywood legend, a man who had crafted a number of the maximum iconic movies in cinematic history. He became the captivating outlaw in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the romantic lead inside The Way We Have Been, the investigative journalist in All of the President's Guys. However, those were roles, characters formed by way of scripts and administrators. The actual Robert Redford was something a ways extra complicated, and the affection he had carried all his life changed into no longer something that might be captured in a 2-hour film. Time had softened the pointy edges of his regrets. He and Lola had built separate lives, observed new loves, new purposes, but that they had in no way virtually misplaced every different. The relationship that they had shared wasn't one which ended with a signature on divorce papers. It became deeper than that, woven into their children, their reminiscences, the quiet understanding that most effective to those who had constructed something they all may want to ever have. In the years following their divorce, that they had remained in contact, no longer out of responsibility, but due to the fact they nevertheless mattered to each other. The love they had shared had truly modified shape. It changed into not the youthful passion that had led them to elope. Not the partnership of two humans seeking to construct an existence. Rather, it had come to be something gentler, something rooted in appreciate and the know-how that they had once been every other's whole world. He had usually famous Lola's strength. Even after the entirety they were via, she had remained constant, never letting heartbreak outline her. She had discovered her own path away from the shadow of his repute. And he had usually been thankful for that. She deserved an existence wherein she wasn't simply Robert Redford's wife, and she or he had constructed one just as he had. Looking lower back now, he understood something he hadn't absolutely grasped once they had been young. Love is not just about the years spent collectively, the milestones, the reminiscences. It is approximately the way someone shapes you, the manner they stay with you, even when they are now not by using your aspect. At 88, Robert Redford had lived a lifestyle full of remarkable moments, however none had been greater profound than the quiet realization that love, actual love, by no means clearly fades. It virtually will become a part of who you are. He had spent his existence telling tales. However, this was the only story he had never informed before, and now he had in the end observed the phrases. That's the quid of cutting-edge video. In case you've made it this a ways, please test out extra movies on our